I heard my husband's voice before I could open my eyes. "She's not going to recover the same way," he said quietly. "Not to me, to someone else. We need to start making practical decisions." The morphine made everything slow, but my mind locked onto those words like a vice. Practical decisions. I had been unconscious for 11 days. I knew because a nurse had whispered it to a colleague somewhere near the foot of my bed, not realizing I could hear them. 11 days, and my husband was already making practical decisions. "My name is Talia Brennan. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed property accountant based in Calgary, Alberta, and the man who had just used the phrase practical decisions about my life while I lay in a hospital bed with a fractured skull and 2 broken ribs was the same man who, 6 years ago, cried at our wedding in front of 200 guests and told me I was the most important person he had ever known. I didn't open my eyes when he came into the room that afternoon. I let him think I was still under. He sat beside me for maybe 4 minutes. I counted his breathing. Then he left. I heard him in the hallway talking to my mother-in-law. "The recovery timeline is uncertain," he said. "The doctors still can't give us a clear picture." A pause. Then her voice. "So we should move forward with what we discussed." What they discussed. "I want to tell you about the accident first, because it matters. 6 weeks before I ended up in that hospital, I had driven out to Canmore for a site review on a property file I was managing for a client. It was early March. Black ice on the Transcanada, which anyone from Alberta knows is a sentence that ends badly. A truck drifted into my lane near the Bow Valley exit. I don't remember the impact. I remember the sun on the mountains that morning, a coffee in my cup holder, a podcast about urban zoning laws, then nothing until the sound of a ventilator and my husband's voice saying things that made my stomach go cold. What I also need to tell you is what my husband didn't know about me. I grew up watching my parents lose everything in a real estate collapse in 2008. My father had trusted a business partner who stripped their jointly held assets, while my dad was dealing with a family illness. I was 14. I watched my mother sit at the kitchen table in Lethbridge, going through bank statements she didn't understand, trying to figure out what had happened to the life they had built together. I swore then, not out of cynicism but out of education, that I would always know exactly where every asset I owned was documented, and that I would always keep something that was purely mine, in a place that only I controlled. When my husband and I married, we combined a lot. Joint bank account. The house in Killarney purchased together in 2019. A shared investment portfolio. A joint line of credit. But I had also, quietly and legally, maintained a numbered holding company registered solely in my name, something I had set up before we met, that I had never dissolved. Inside it, a secondary savings account, about $47,000 in GICs, and a climate-controlled storage unit in Northwest Calgary that I rented annually, in cash, renewed each January without fail. Inside that storage unit was a lockbox. Inside the lockbox, a copy of every financial document I had ever signed, my original marriage contract, the prenuptial agreement my husband had agreed to but conveniently misremembered the terms of, the original deed to a small parcel of land my grandmother had left me in her will, and a sealed envelope I had prepared 3 years into our marriage during a period when things between us had been difficult. The envelope was labeled in my own handwriting, in case I am ever incapacitated or unable to speak for myself. I had told no one about it, not my sister, not my closest friend, not my accountant who was a colleague, not a confidant, just me in a storage unit on Sarcee Trail, Nightrisby, and a lockbox that required a key I kept inside a hollowed-out book on my office shelf at home. The key was still there. My husband had no reason to look for it. He didn't know the book existed as anything other than a book. By the time I was transferred out of the ICU into a step-down room, I had pieced together most of what had happened from fragments. A nurse mentioning that my emergency contact had been updated, my mother-in-law asking a hospital administrator about estate matters in a voice she probably thought was quiet, my husband telling my sister that he was handling the finances while Talia recovers and that she didn't need to worry about the details, My sister, who trusted everyone, said okay. The house had been listed. I found out when a physio aide, a young woman maybe 22, was doing a routine mobility assessment and mentioned offhand that she had grown up in Killarney and loved the neighborhood. "Are you thinking of moving?" she asked brightly. I stared at her. "My husband mentioned we might sell," I said carefully. She nodded like this was normal. I asked her what she had heard. She said the listing had gone up 3 days ago. She'd seen it on a real estate app. Our house, listed 3 days ago, while I was in a step-down room learning to hold a cup again. I didn't cry. I had learned not to cry in front of people when the information was still useful. I smiled at the physio aide and said thank you. And as soon as she left, I stared at the ceiling for a long time and did something I am very good at. I started building a spreadsheet in my head. The house listing told me one thing clearly. My husband wasn't waiting to see how I recovered. He was acting. And that meant I needed to act faster. From a hospital bed, with limited phone access, and a head that still ached when I turned too quickly. My first call was to my sister, not to tell her what I knew, to ask her to bring me something from my home office when she came to visit. A book. I described it. Pale blue cover, narrow spine. It's on the second shelf from the top, left side. She said sure, no problem. She brought it 2 days later. My husband wasn't with her. I had chosen the timing deliberately, knowing he had a site meeting that afternoon. I slipped the key out in the bathroom. I held it in my palm for a moment. Then I asked my sister to step out while I made a call about insurance, which was technically true. I called my lawyer, not the family lawyer my husband and I had used together, my personal lawyer, a woman I had retained privately 3 years ago during that difficult period, who knew about the holding company, who had helped me draft the contents of the sealed envelope, and who had kept all of it entirely separate from anything my husband was connected to. "Her name is Fatima," she answered on the second ring. I told her, "I'm in the hospital. I've been here for 2 weeks. My husband has listed our house without my consent. And I believe he is attempting to access or liquidate assets, under the assumption that my incapacity gives him authority to do so. I need you to tell me what he can and cannot legally do." She was quiet for 3 seconds, then, "Are you safe?" I said yes. I said I just need information. She told me what I already suspected. In Alberta, a spouse does not automatically gain legal authority over another spouse's sole assets during a medical incapacity. Joint assets are different, but anything held in my name alone, the holding company, the storage unit contents, the land from my grandmother's estate, none of that was touchable without a formal enduring power of attorney or a court-ordered trusteeship, neither of which my husband had obtained. He could list our joint house for sale. He could not close on it without my signature, because the property title required both spouses to execute the transfer. "So the listing is legal," she said, "but the closing isn't, not without you." "He doesn't know that," I said. "Or he's counting on you being too impaired to notice," she said. I was quiet. "Talia," she said, "do you want to protect yourself, or do you want to wait and see?" I told her I had been waiting and seeing my entire marriage. I was done. What happened over the next 3 weeks, while I was still technically a hospital patient, was not dramatic, it was precise. Fatima filed a caveat on the property title through the Alberta Land Titles Office, which effectively froze any transfer without my written authorization. The real estate agent my husband had hired, a colleague of his from his network, received a letter from Fatima's office within 48 hours informing him that the listing had been placed without the co-owner's knowledge or consent during a period of medical incapacity, and that any proceeds from a sale would be subject to legal challenge. The listing came down 4 days later. My husband didn't mention it when he visited. He brought flowers. Grocery store tulips, the kind he always bought when he felt guilty about something. Yellow, slightly wilted at the edges. He sat beside my bed and talked about my recovery and the weather in Calgary, and a show he had been watching. He held my hand. I let him. I looked at the tulips and thought about the spreadsheet in my head. which was growing more detailed by the hour. The moment that changed everything, or rather the moment that confirmed everything I had already calculated, came on a Thursday evening. My sister had stepped out to get coffee. My husband didn't know she had been sharing information with me, because she didn't know she'd been doing it. She had just been answering my questions naturally, the way she always did, because she had no reason to think anything was wrong. She was still operating on the assumption that my husband was a grieving, exhausted spouse doing his best. She had told me casually that my mother-in-law had been helping out at the house, organizing things. Getting it ready, she said. Getting it ready for what? I had asked. She didn't know. That Thursday, a family friend came to visit me. She was the kind of person who didn't think before she spoke, which made her one of the most useful people I knew in that period. She mentioned in passing that she had seen my mother-in-law at an estate sale company in Bridgeland, not shopping, meeting with the owners. She had a folder, the kind of folder with a logo on it. I thanked her for the visit, and when she left I called Fatima again. I said, I think they're planning to liquidate the contents of our house before I'm discharged. She said, can you prove it? I said, not yet, but I have a storage unit key and I need someone I trust to access it before they find out it exists. I want to stop here and tell you something about the sealed envelope, because that's what this is really about. When I prepared that envelope 3 years ago, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't paranoid. I was methodical. I had seen what happened to people who weren't, including my own mother, and I had decided that if I was ever in a position where I could not speak for myself, I wanted to have already spoken. Inside the envelope was a statutory declaration witnessed by a notary. It outlined, in precise language, the assets held in my holding company that were separate from the marital estate, the terms of my grandmother's land transfer which my husband had never acknowledged or signed, a record of a $22,000 deposit I had made into our joint account from my personal savings at the start of our marriage, to cover renovation costs, for which I had retained documentation of the source funds, and a clause. The clause came from my grandmother's estate documents. She had been a very careful woman. Her will included a provision that the parcel of land she left me could not be transferred to or claimed by a spouse or common law partner under any circumstances, including incapacity or death, without a separately executed consent document signed by me while of sound mind and in the presence of a notary. My husband had been told about the land. He had never been told about that clause. He had assumed, apparently, that my incapacity made it part of the accessible estate. It was not. Fatima's articling student drove to the storage unit on a Wednesday morning. She had my written authorization, which Fatima had prepared from the hospital room paperwork I had signed. She photographed everything in the lockbox, retrieved the sealed envelope, and had it formally opened and recorded in the presence of a commissioner of O's. My husband, at that moment, was meeting with a mortgage broker. I know because my sister mentioned it when she came to visit that afternoon. She thought he was looking into refinancing options for after my recovery. She still trusted him. I said, that's okay. I trust Fatima. The family meeting happened 10 days before I was discharged. My husband requested it. He sat across from me with my mother-in-law beside him and a printed document on the table, which he slid toward me with what I can only describe as carefully practiced gentleness. It was a financial management agreement. It outlined his authority to manage joint and household assets during my ongoing recovery. It was written to sound administrative. It was designed to give him signing authority over things that were not jointly held. I read it twice. Then I looked at him. Where did this come from? I asked. I had a lawyer draft it, he said. It's just to simplify things while you're getting better. I asked which lawyer. He named someone I didn't recognize. I nodded slowly. I'd like to have Fatima review it, I said. He paused, just a fraction of a second. But I had been watching him for 6 years and I knew every pause he made and what they meant. That pause meant he hadn't known I was still in contact with Fatima. Of course, he said. Whatever makes you comfortable. I signed nothing. 3 days later, Fatima sent him a letter. It was 2 pages long and cited 4 sections of the Alberta Matrimonial Property Act. It outlined the caveat on the property title, the protected status of the holding company assets, the grandmother clause on the land parcel, and a formal notice that any attempt to liquidate household contents without my written consent would constitute a breach of matrimonial property obligations. It also noted that she had documentation of the mortgage broker meeting, the estate sale company contact, and the updated emergency contact at the hospital. She included a line at the end that I had asked her to include. It said, "My client is fully aware of the decisions being made on her behalf. She has been aware for some time." He called me that night. His voice was different, flatter. The performance had dropped. "Talia," he said, "can we talk about this privately?" I said, "We can talk to Fatima together. I'll have her schedule a meeting." He hung up. "I want to tell you about the morning I was discharged, because it was nothing like what I had imagined. I had imagined it would feel like a confrontation, like walking back into a war zone. But when I came home, the house was exactly as it had been, because the caveat had stopped everything in its tracks. My books were on the shelves. My grandmother's photograph was still on the mantel. The key was still in the book. Nothing had been taken. Not yet. My husband was there. He had picked me up from the hospital himself. He carried my bag inside. He made tea. We sat at the kitchen table in a silence that was very different from every other silence we had shared. I'm not going to describe the divorce process in detail, because it is still ongoing, and Fatima has advised me not to. What I will tell you is this. The prenuptial agreement, which my husband had signed and then claimed to have forgotten the terms of, was very clear about the separation of premarital assets. The $22,000 I had contributed to joint renovations was documented. The holding company was legally distinct. The land was protected by my grandmother's clause, and the sealed envelope recorded and witnessed by a commissioner of oaths had established my intent and my awareness before any of this happened. He had counted on my incapacity making me manageable. He had not counted on me having already prepared for exactly that. The moment that surprised me most was something small, something I hadn't planned for. When Fatima was reviewing the estate documents with me a few weeks after discharge, she pointed to the grandmother clause and said, "Your grandmother added this herself. She amended the will specifically to include it about 2 years before she died." I hadn't known that. I hadn't known it was intentional. I had always assumed it was standard estate language. My grandmother had grown up in post-war Quebec with nothing. She had built everything she owned herself. She had watched 2 women in her family lose assets to men who had legal access to them during moments of vulnerability. She had added that clause because she knew what I might someday face. She had protected me before I knew I needed it. She had left me more than land. She had left me a door that could not be opened by anyone but me. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending weeks performing weakness while actually working, from letting someone believe they have won while you are methodically making sure they haven't, from lying in a hospital bed calculating instead of grieving. I don't recommend it. It takes something from you. It takes the version of you that wanted things to be simple, that wanted to believe the person beside you at the altar was the person you thought they were. I grieved that version of my marriage. I am still grieving it. I want to be honest about that because I think the story is easier to tell when it ends cleanly. And it doesn't end cleanly. I am 31 years old, living in a house that is now legally mine alone, because he moved out during proceedings, making tea in a kitchen that is very quiet. And I am okay. Not triumphant. Just okay. Which some days feels like more than enough. My sister called me last week. She had finally understood the full picture. And she was angrier than I was. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed you to be natural around him." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Grandma would have liked this." The part about the envelope. I think she's right. I think my grandmother would have recognized the spreadsheet in my head. She would have understood the hollowed-out book, and the storage unit key, and the sealed envelope, and the decision to stay quiet while building something that could not be undone. She would have said, "You were always her granddaughter." They thought the accident had made me smaller. They hadn't considered that I'd spent years, quietly and without announcement, making sure that no matter what happened, I would already have spoken. I used to think that being prepared was a kind of pessimism, that keeping a lockbox in a storage unit on Sarcee Trail, maintaining a holding company no one knew about, sealing an envelope addressed to myself in case of emergency. I used to think all of that said something unflattering about how I moved through the world, like I was waiting for people to fail me instead of trusting them not to. I don't think that anymore. What I understand now is that preparation isn't distrust. It's integrity made tangible. It's the physical form of knowing your own worth well enough to protect it. My grandmother understood this. She had nothing handed to her, and she built what she had carefully, deliberately, and she amended her will 2 years before she died to make sure I couldn't be stripped of what she left me. She didn't do that because she was afraid. She did it because she was honest about how the world sometimes works, and she loved me enough to act on that honesty before I needed her to. The thing about what happened to me, the accident, the hospital, my husband quietly listing our house while I was relearning how to hold a cup, is that none of it worked the way he expected, because I had already done the work of being clear-headed before the crisis arrived, not during it, before. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. They focus on the confrontation, the lawyer's letter, the caveat on the title. But the real decision was made years earlier, alone, at a desk, thinking through uncomfortable possibilities and writing them down anyway. That kind of thinking requires something that isn't easy to name. It's not just intelligence, though it involves thinking carefully. It's the willingness to be honest with yourself about your situation, even when honesty is uncomfortable. To look at a relationship, a legal document, a financial arrangement, and ask, what would happen to me if this went wrong? Not because you're planning for it to go wrong, but because you respect yourself enough to have an answer. And then there's the part that came after, the weeks in the hospital, staying quiet, letting my husband believe he had the upper hand while Fatima filed paperwork and photographed lockboxes and recorded sealed envelopes. That took something different. Not cleverness, steadiness. The ability to feel afraid and betrayed and exhausted and still move forward one careful step at a time without letting emotion collapse the plan. My sister asked me later how I kept it together. I said I didn't, not entirely. I cried alone twice. But I kept going anyway because I knew that stopping wouldn't make anything more fair. That's what I want people to take from this, if anything. Not a blueprint for hiding assets or preparing for divorce. Just this. The people who take advantage of others during moments of vulnerability are counting on you to not have thought ahead. They are counting on shock and grief and exhaustion to do their work for them. The answer to that isn't bitterness, it's preparation. It's clarity. It's the quiet, unglamorous work of knowing your own life well enough that no one else can narrate it for you while you're not in the room. My grandmother left me land, but what she really left me was the example of a woman who understood that dignity has to be protected deliberately, not just hoped for. I'm still learning to live in a house that's quieter than I expected it to be at 31, but it's mine. Fully, legally, undeniably mine. And that on most days is enough to keep going.